Our purpose today is to showcase the Long Island Pine Barrens and to honor those who made it happen, to learn from them, and to distill lessons from the case. We want to have a dialogue with you about all of that, not just to hear from people up here as talking heads, but to engage in a discussion at our tables, to identify how can the lessons from the Pine Barrens be applied to other situations. What are the kinds of disputes we're concerned about? And in what ways might this tell us something about them? How do we have processes, like consensus-building processes, happen not by happenstance, not because the right people happened to be at the right place at the right time, had the right frame of mind, were able to intervene in a way that made it happen? How can we have this happen as a matter of course, not just as an exception? And so we want to examine that with you. So this is an important opportunity for so many of us to be gathered together from so many different agencies with so many different perspectives, people from the legislature, to be able to grapple together with these very important questions. Later on, as I say, we'll be breaking into small groups and having conversations about this and to generate some ideas that we could all begin to work on together. So I hope you'll be able to stay right through the end of the program until 1 o'clock. Our first two speakers are the protagonists, the original protagonists, or at least represent those, the set of interests and the set of organizations that came to be the protagonists. Dick Amper, I'm going to call on Dick Amper first. Dick Amper is the executive director of the Long Island Pine Barrens Society, and through his determination, forced the issue to the table for this process to eventually resolve it. So Dick, a great pleasure to have you with us today, and I look forward to your telling us of the story of how this came to be.
Well, thank you, Alan, and thank you all for your interest and concern. This is an ongoing process and a very exciting one for us. One of the truly great conflicts between environmentalists and developers played itself out on Long Island in 5 years of very, very ugly confrontation. Alan is right that there were few who thought that we would produce a positive result. In fact, I have been buttonholed both by Alan and by some of you on arrival here today who are aware that the efforts to implement the Pine Barrens Act are also not without conflict, but we are hoping that today will allow you to help us continue those things that we've learned from our previous conflict transition into consensus so that we can keep this on track. It was, in fact, a great and remarkable coming together of the special interest, the developers who had individual projects in a very sensitive area of Long Island that they wanted to move ahead with without delay, and the public interest in drinking water protection and habitat preservation. The Long Island Pine Barrens, as you must know, overlies the greatest quantities of the purest drinking water left on Long Island, and that same area boasts the greatest diversity of plant and animal species anywhere in the state. So it was understandable why environmentalists would coalesce 125 groups strong to defend the Pine Barrens against a very, very difficult problem. The local governments involved were granting approvals for development in the last 100,000 acres of Pine Barrens that once covered 25% of Long Island on a project-by-project basis. And what we argued in front of local government is that there needed to be a plan. We needed to plan first and build only if and where it was safe to build, that while it might not be necessary and probably wasn't necessary to preserve a whole 100,000 acres, to continue to approve the projects one at a time, and there were some 238 of them, that we really ought to stop long enough to consider the cumulative impacts of all of what was going on and decide where development should proceed and where it must not. The parties came together after a 4-year legal battle in which the Court of Appeals acknowledged that this was indeed a sensitive area and that efforts of local government had indeed failed. They admonished the state legislature to produce some sort of plan that would allow preservation of the Pine Barrens on the one hand, and at the same time needed and balanced real estate development. Legislature took that on quite remarkably in the first lesson about how to obtain consensus by not trying to impose a solution on anyone, but merely inviting the protagonists, as we're being called this morning, to sit down and sort out what we needed, what our problems were, and how they could be resolved. The jury's still out on that process. We passed historic legislation that was the result of a consensus about which we'll be talking throughout the morning, but the implementation of that process has been difficult. There have been ongoing legal confrontations and other confrontations in these public policy matters as we've tried to put this plan into place and make it work. And this is a timely and important opportunity for us now to look back at what worked and brought us this agreement a year ago and see how those same principles and same devices will allow us to see this through to implementation so that the concerns of all parties are properly addressed. In 1989, the environmentalists who were frustrated by this piecemeal carving up of the Pine Barrens without a plan sought to produce a plan first and then a proper organized building project, a building scenario. The developers, for their part, were frustrated that sometimes a project that should have taken 6 months to win approval took 6 years to win approval with all of the financial implications, and there was a clear conflict between these two parties, and there was a clear need to accommodate the builders' entitlements to build where it wasn't harmful without delay, at the same time to have a sensible plan that protected drinking water and habitat. The other thing that the environmental groups required was a process of acquisitions and tougher regulations where we would acquire the most sensitive lands and develop regulations that would permit development to move ahead without serious threats to the environment. The acquisitions were funded in large measure by the Clean Drinking Water Protection Program, a bond issue, if you would, that involved basically using sales tax money, a portion of the Suffolk County sales tax, to purchase land in the groundwater-sensitive Pine Barrens. All in all, 84% of the voters in Suffolk twice approved this kind of referendum, and it involves some $150 million in land acquisitions, more being spent on land acquisitions in Suffolk County than in 45 of the 50 states in this country. So there's broad-based support for this. The negotiations to solve the problem began while the litigation was still in progress. And the negotiations sought certainty for both sides. Certainty on the part of developers that there would be a plan in place that would allow projects to move ahead on a regularized basis without harm and without delay, and which encouraged others of us to believe that our drinking water resources and the Pine Barrens ecosystem would be preserved. We, in effect, drew a line in the sand. The Pine Barrens, famous for its sandy soils, we basically drew a line in the sand and said, this shall remain in its natural condition, and this will be allowed to be developed. That accommodated the needs of both sides. If the developers were to know where they could build without delay, they would benefit. If the rest of us knew that the minimum area required to protect this ecosystem was now to be secured, the consensus that we sought had a good basis and a good foundation. The Pine Barrens Protection Act of 1993 should serve everybody's interest. However, 10 months later, we find that not a single acre of the Pine Barrens has been purchased. Local dollars are being encumbered by local political problems. The state budget, as you know, wears on, and the matching funds that were required to compensate private property owners, a serious concern to developers, and also to preserve the land that we need to protect permanently, have not begun flowing. Local government, which we all believe caused the problem in the first place, is continuing to permit assaults on the core area, the area not to be developed, at the same time that we all agreed that the core area would remain in its natural state and that a compatible growth area would be the place where development would be directed. So the local government representatives who helped cause the problem have been granting permission and considering permission for still more development into that core preservation area, in effect moving the line in the sand. Worst of all, the Commission has continued to approve individual applications before the statutory deadline of July 14th, when a plan is put into place. They are looking at individual applications and projects prior to the time that the plan is put in place, the very problem that brought us into confrontation in the first place. The peacemakers from last year have also periodically lost sight of what it was that worked and how they brought us together. Some of them have been standing in the wings fairly shrilly criticizing those who are merely pursuing what we've been pursuing consistently for the last 5 years, some certainty that one portion would be preserved and the other portion developed. Not surprisingly, the developers and the environmentalists remain close together because the interests that brought them together have not changed. They found a mechanism that would allow both sides to be served, and they share the frustration that we've encountered in trying to get it implemented in a way that benefits everyone involved. We hear the developers, for their part, fighting against invasion of the core preservation area, not because that was so important to them, but because it was important to the negotiating partners. And we see environmentalists calling for expedited considerations of benign projects, not because we're so eager to see any portion of the Pine Barrens cut down, but because that's part of the agreement that produced the accommodation. So this is the critical period. This is the crucial test of whether we properly understand what worked for us, what brought us all together, what produced the consensus. This is the opportunity to find out whether we've learned what allowed us to accommodate one another's interests without really having to make many concessions. For the environmentalist part, we never argued that all of the Pine Barrens had to be protected. We just needed to know which part was going to be adequate and how we were going to go about doing it. We also want to keep this historic agreement together so that the promise of last year can be the hope of future generations, both in terms of conflict resolution and in terms of protecting this great treasure on Long Island. So we need now to start buying land. That was a major premise of the agreement, and we need county and state government now to use their resources, and the government folks and the peacemakers who wanted to see this thing work, now to apply the pressure to make it work, so that the developers who cannot build in the restricted core area are compensated, and so that that land ends up public land, and we have the contiguous green belt necessary to make that ecosystem solidly protected. We have to stop moving the line in the sand. If the agreement was certainty, if the agreement was obtained because each side would have certainty that the land they needed to have for their purposes would be used in that way, then that is inviolate. We compromise the agreement and the basis for the agreement if we do not uphold those understandings. And we need, finally, to complete the plan so the developers, for their part, where they will know where they can build safely and without delay, and the rest of the people of Long Island will know that protection of their drinking water and this precious habitat have been secured. So I hope during the course of the day that we'll have an opportunity to review and obtain your input as to what needs to be done to secure the success through the process of implementation. That's a specific problem to the Pine Barrens, but it really goes to the heart of how it is that these conflicts are turned into consensus. If we use the tools that work, understand the objectives of the sides that needed to be reconciled, and find and examine carefully precisely what achieved the consensus, then the risk of our falling apart, the risk of our losing what's been obtained diminishes, and the success of conflict resolution is dramatically demonstrated. So we need your help, we need your input, and we will continue to work in a very consistent fashion to bring about those things to which we've all come to agree. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dick. We were scheduled to have Bob Wiebold speak for the role that the developers played in this dispute, and how Bob, to have Bob tell you, as he has, as I have heard him tell it very, very passionately and eloquently about how his own evolution came about in this case, and Bob seems to be missing in action. We don't know where he is. We've tried to locate him, and we can't find him. So I'm going to ask the rest of the panel to fill in, to tell the story from their perspectives about the role he played and what you observed about his own evolution and the evolution of the developer's thinking. What happened in this, as you can best tell it from his perspective? Why don't we all shift down a little bit so you guys are at the table? Dick, you want to start? Because you've gotten to know Bob very well throughout all of this.
I must candidly say to you that Bob Wiebold is one of the truly forward-thinking folks in the process, and I'm not sure how much of an evolution that he underwent. History will show that Bob Wiebold and Jim Larocca, who's sitting here, very early on recognized just how unproductive the conflict was, and how simply defeating a lawsuit or a challenge was not solving the problem. Wiebold counseled the Long Island Builders Institute almost from day one that simply going after a small not-for-profit organization was not likely to produce the kind of consistent certainty that was needed by the building industry on Long Island. It was a partisan, it was a self-serving special interest position that he took, but he had this larger view from the outset that those differences ought to be reconciled and that the problem ought to be addressed rather than that there ought to be skirmishing on an ongoing basis. And his advice was, and I think Jim could probably tell us better from his own perspective, the advice is only as good as the audience is prepared to hear it. And there were those that were so as Alan pointed out, so convinced that this could not be resolved, that environmentalists would not be reasonable, that a clear win of a war was possible, that I think some of the sager, the more prescient advice was ignored for a long period of time. But those who first identified the need to solve the problem rather than to strike a decisive blow against the protagonist were the ones that were ultimately listened to, and they played a very significant role in getting folks to listen and getting folks to find accommodation.
Let me introduce the two other members of the panel to my right. James Larocca is formerly the State Transportation Commissioner. He was president of the Long Island Association, and I'll let him describe what that group was and the role it played at the time that the Pine Barrens dispute was both in the courts and then finally resolved, and is now a partner at Cullen and Dyckman, a law firm in Garden City. And to his right, Tim Hopkins is an attorney with the Suffolk County Water Authority. Prior to joining the authority, he was a mediator with the State Attorney General's Office, Bureau of Consumer Frauds and Protection. He participated in drafting the Pine Barrens Protection Act and is serving as staff attorney for the Pine Barrens Joint Planning and Policy Commission. Thank you both for being here, gentlemen. Jim, do you want to pick up on the story of Bob's participation and
Sure. I'm looking ahead to what we were going to do at 10:40, so I won't have anything left to say when my turn comes by jumping in here now. But a couple of the broad thoughts. The real lessons we want to apply here today are to other possible conflicts. So I want to try to emphasize what I see in this that might have application elsewhere. But the facts and the circumstances of this particular matter are, I think, very interesting, and as Dick observes, it ain't over yet because there's elements of this conflict that are still there. Out on the island, like a lot of other places, if you take the 10 years leading up to the formal beginning of this conflict in 1987, we went through the tail end of the recession that had been there in the late 70s and early 80s, and then found ourselves in the midst of the full-blown 80s economy, which saw a lot of building, a lot of very fevered inflation, a lot of things going on in real estate and development. And the suit came, as I say, in 1987, and when it occurred, it had been really quite some time since our community, this vast community of communities we call Long Island, had to pause and consider whether or not these two sets of values, the economy on one side and the environment on the other, were in fact two sides of a polar conflict, and if so, what was to be done about it. And the process from the onset of the lawsuit to its settlement, which manifested itself in the form of legislation, which turned out to be 6 years later, had nothing to do with parties deciding to surrender their interests. And now that I'm back in the private sector in the law all the time, I see that the process of settlement is far more frequent than the process of winning and losing in litigation. And what happened in this case, in this very broad public policy conflict, was not that either side, if in fact these were ever sides, but that either side surrendered its interest, but rather discovered their mutual interest. And the core element in any process of conflict resolution, in a fully formal setting in court, all the way through to the informal kinds of processes, and some of the processes that are being suggested by this new forum and some of those activities, has to do with parties finding their mutuality. Now, it may be that parties, third parties, others, can help in that process, but ultimately the parties in conflict have to discover that they in fact share some interest and share some objective. That's what happened in this case. When people thought about the condition of the economy into the late 80s, and then the rapid fire change that occurred in the late 80s up through 90, 91, the onset of a whole different set of calculations, it became clear that, well, several things became clear. One was that when the environment and the economy are genuinely in conflict over time, more often than not, it is the environment that loses. It's perhaps not as we would want it to be, but the history of important decision-making suggests that very often that's what happens. There's also a discovery that that is more likely to happen in a down economy. People will surrender up things more easily when they feel direct economic threat than they would in other times. And I think those factors were beginning to be discovered and felt and understood. At the same time, the people on the so-called economic side of this conflict, I think, had come to recognize that in a place like Long Island, the environmental quality of the place was as important an economic consideration as any other. And therefore, the historic view that this was only conflict and only warfare gave way to something else, which was the mutual discovery that as a matter of economics, the environment was important, and as a matter of environment, the economy is important, because a floundering economy will not support environmental quality and environmental values to the same extent as a healthy economy. And in a place that values its quality of life for a highly paid, educated workforce that demands important amenities in their communities, there was an understanding that the economy would not prosper without a healthy environment. The environment will not prosper without a supportive and healthy economy. So as that process of mutuality and mutual discovery occurred, I think the path began to become obvious for how to resolve this particular conflict. Now, if in fact mutuality is discovered, that's only part of the matter. You also have the personalities that are involved. It's very important. You have to understand what everybody needs out of this process. Some of it very noble and very important, some of it very personal and close to the individual parties. And there also needs to be a process of leverage. A lot of us in and around the public policy process over the years will say that litigation is the least good way to make public policy. In the modern history of this country, far too often it is courts that make public policy because legislative and executive processes don't seem to get it done. Well, in the process of this kind of conflict and conflict resolution, the litigation was very important. It is the leverage that the parties use, appropriately so, to advance their point of view. And the disposition of that litigation, the formal part of it, becomes an important part of the process. That was clearly the case here. There's a sheet that describes key points along the way, and it will describe that in one particular summer we had a process going where we thought we were making a lot of progress. I guess that would have been in the summer of '92, but the litigation was going hot and heavy, and the Court of Appeals was expected to act, and the parties had made their respective judgments about how they would likely fare before the Court of Appeals, and that became an important consideration to people's disposition to deal then. So the litigation in the formal setting is always a very critical and important part of all this. When we finally got past the Court of Appeals and the parties were agreeable to trying again, coming back together again, the core matter of their mutuality was still there. I believe it's there to this very day, and for that reason this will continue to be a successful process. But that doesn't mean on any given day of the week it's apparent to everybody, or that some people may be feeling a little more mutual than others on a particular day. And what has happened toward the later stages of getting this bill and getting this agreement really in the spring of a year ago was all of the factors I've described, plus the additional one of when this conflict reached a certain point in time, it had the benefit of additional parties and interests coming in very successful and productive and positive ways. So the two legislators who welcomed us here this morning were very, very important to that. Mike LoGrande and the Suffolk County Water Authority entering when they did provided an enormous bit of support and momentum for the process. So the process in, I would think, almost any comparable conflict at some point will need to begin to involve additional interests and parties that have a stake in the outcome. And as that happens, that can be a very positive part of the process that leads to the end result. Now, we all know that it is said that it ain't over till it's over. There was a lot of that leading up to the signing of the bill, but in part in connection with what Dick has said here today, and those of you who are following this now, sometimes it ain't over when it's over. In the sense that for all of the excitement and exhilaration that all the parties and others that were involved in this felt last summer when this was done, in some respects the hardest part of this process is the one that's out there now, because these very broad agreements and concepts and noble aspirations are now being reduced to very site-specific application, implementation. And each of those site-specific issues has the capacity to blow up. Some are more tender than others. So that one of the things that I think is important in most conflicts resolution processes is to not lose sight of the process for implementation and staying with it after the primary agreements are reached. The real measure of the success of this enterprise ultimately will not be the bill that was passed last summer. It will be whether or not the bill and the process was successful following the passage of that legislation. And Dick is quite correct that this is a very critical phase in that process. It's critical because one of the key elements was this matter of money, as it so often is in in the public policy process. And without the funds necessary to proceed with an acquisition program consistent with the intent of the framers, this process will stumble. There's also a second element. It's less hard to quantify because you can take the funding question and everybody has a view of what the necessary pace of funding needs to be. The second one is reminding all of the parties how important it is to keep the same spirit and mutuality that was there in the formation alive and well in each of the site-specific disputes and processes that is there now. I think it's very important that the parties try to find accommodation on these early site questions to build the successes that will provide for other successes. And I don't have any reason to not believe that that will happen, but I think it's important because it really hasn't happened yet to the extent that many of us are hoping for, that the same process of settling these matters by mutual consent has got to be part of this implementation process, or ultimately, as I say, it won't be the fact that a bill was passed, but that it could not be applied in a way that was hoped for. Final thought is that as this process of creating or entertaining the possibility of a permanent facility in the state of New York in some form for these kinds of public policy dispute resolutions is considered, it's very important to understand that every party to every conflict has a right to be considered respectfully, to be accorded access to the process. What happens in a place like Long Island, which I don't think is unique, Dick mentioned 125 environmental groups. Well, that covers a range of very well constituted, very well funded organizations, right on down through somebody with a letterhead and a title and so forth. And on the economic side, or the other side of what was this apparent ledger, we have people that will use a description like the developers. Well, that covers a wide range of interests as well. One of the things that was very important in this process was that the side of the transaction being described as the economic interest had to be understood to be covering as wide an array of interests, from the very large to the very substantial to perhaps very local and very small. But each of the interests, parties of interest, has to be accorded their place in the process, because it is the nature of the processes we've created in the law, in regulation, administrative law in this state as elsewhere, that if you don't capture in your agreements all of the necessary parties, those who are not part of the process do have their avenues to confound your result. So the process of inclusion becomes a very, very important part of this. I'll stop there and
Thank you, Jim. Tim, before I bring you in, let me see what questions there might be out here in the group. Yes, please.
Something that really confuses me. I had understood that local government had a pretty strong role in all of this. The three towns initially, and then after the legislation became law, the commission.
Yeah,
Dick, please.
this is a very, very good point, because throughout the early phases of the conflict, the Pine Barrens Society tried to narrow the dispute and not to make it a battle between economic and environmental interests, which we never believed that it was. We thought the problem was the failure of local government to properly plan this special area. And it is then not surprising that because there's such a commitment statewide, but particularly on Long Island, to home rule, that the input of the towns should continue to be so problematic. Ultimately, we had to go through the entire legal system to the state's highest court. The court said that local government had failed. It was the state legislature that unanimously said, here's the way to fix that. But they recognized, as indeed the reality required, that there must be a continuing role for local government in determining the shaping of land use policies there. But once the matter returned to those municipalities, the same sort of provincialism emerged, the same sort of disposition to control the land use process as they had in the past, and the same resistance to a regional, the development of a regional system, reared its ugly head again, and it has been problems compelling local government to do that. What has kept us on track, and what I think will ultimately produce the result, you understand that, or everyone should understand that ultimately the towns must sign off unanimously or this legislation sunsets. And I am not so confident that they will simply change their minds and be happy to give up land use control there, but that the confluence of all of these forces for something that will work both economically and environmentally will make it irresistible. There were many in local government that resisted this legislation to the end and merely supported it because there was such a wave of enthusiasm for it, it would be difficult for them to be the spoiler. I hope and think that that is what our best chances are of prevailing now. But the notion of people giving up their fiefdoms, their spheres of influence for a larger purpose, really goes to the heart of this whole matter, and how we reconcile state legislation with local traditions is something to be watched very carefully.
Do you want to add anything?
Just to emphasize the specific question, the towns do have an effective veto. That part of it is still very important. And also, in the course of the process, recall that the towns were the defendants. And the supervisor of the town of Southampton made a judgment at one point to stop fighting in effect, I guess it was after the appellate division, and agreed to go ahead and start the generic process there. And I think that was a cardinal point in the disposition of the others to begin to find another way, because the solid front of the towns was changed. But they do retain that capacity, very important, to veto this outcome.
Tim, explain, if you would, the makeup of the commission.
Okay, it's a 5-member commission with a governor's representative representing the state's interest, the county executive representing the county's interests, and supervisors from the 3 towns that are part of the Central Pine Barrens. And a balancing between all 5 of those members is an attempt to get the local participation and the state level and county level participation and all the interests represented in the decision-making process.
So as these what have proved to be contentious implementation issues have arisen, is it a coalition of the towns overriding the county and the state? I mean, is that how it's breaking down?
There really hasn't been much of a breaking down at all from the perspective of the commissioners. They've been voting in pretty solid blocks on almost all issues. They recognize a need to come to a mutual agreement on all the issues, and they certainly want to see a satisfactory resolution to all the problems, and recognize that there's going to that they may not all get exactly what they want, but that there's going to be a little give and take from each of them to resolve the problems.
Mm-hmm.
Describe the advisory.
Oh, well, there's also an advisory committee that represents pretty much all the other interests, other than governmental interests, that participated in the drafting of the of the Pine Barrens Protection Act, and are also charged with the duty of participating in the actual plan development process. And those meetings have been a little more contentious, and sometimes the voting that occurs in those meetings comes out 50% for, 50% against, as you would imagine, which complicates the issues even greater, and provides absolutely no help for the commissioners on some of the most critical issues. So they have to deal with that. They have to weigh the interests of all the important groups in the area, and the advisory committee provides that outlet for them, and then they can weigh and judge what their decisions, the implications of their decisions against those members, and try to get a feel of how they should proceed on certain matters.
Are we finding here that there were inadequate principles or guidelines in place in order that the particular applications could be reviewed in a way that everybody would find satisfactory, and this is kind of an open question to all of you, or was it taken in terms of establishing principles as far as you think it could have gone at that early stage?
Well, I think Dick may be able to answer that question.
To the defense of the commissioners, the tradition of individual folks with specific development projects wanting to move ahead and having always been able to do so didn't die on the day that the governor signed this legislation. And so the commission was besieged by individual applications for this exemption or this early approval or that special exception or this special hardship consideration. And to some extent, that worked against the preferred process of having the commissioners focus on the production of a plan that would then tell everyone precisely what they could and couldn't do and resolve all of that. Sequentially, it would have been better if we could put the plan in place and address those specific problems afterward. That's what caused the conflict in the first place, and so that's what we're hoping to do. That's what we've been struggling to do, is to minimize the number of decisions on specific applications that are made prior to the time a draft plan is put in place. In fairness, it couldn't have been done any differently. The timetable for putting a plan in place and meeting the specific deadlines of this legislation was very demanding, and the commission and the planning staffs and the folks at the Suffolk County Water Authority have done a yeoman's job at keeping this on target. It was just not likely that everybody was going to stop coming and asking for their particular problem to be solved while the larger problem was resolved, but we're so close now to the creation of that draft plan that I think those specific assaults on process will soon be behind us.
Yes, please.
Yeah, if you could summarize what exactly is left for this commission to do, and what time frame, and when this legislation sunsets. And secondly, could you explain what sticks versus carrots there are in the legislature or in the powers of the commission to implement the basic goal of the legislation?
I can try to address that. Basically, the next major deadline would be the publishing of the draft plan, which is due, I believe, July 14th or 15th of this year. After that period, there's part of the draft plan is a draft generic environmental impact statement. Following that period, will be a period of review and changes to the plan and the GEIS. Following that process, there will be also public hearings within each of the 3 towns that are involved. 6 months after, 3 months after the draft plan is published, there's supposed to be adoption of findings by the commission, and then those findings would be forwarded to the 3 towns, and the 3 towns would then have, I believe, 3 months in order to adopt the findings of the commission, at which time the findings would be forwarded to the commission, and then the commission would vote on final adoption of the plan, which is scheduled to happen no later than 8 months after the draft plan was published. So that would be the final sunset provision. I believe it's somewhere in March of 1995 that there has to be a unanimous adoption of the plan by the 5 commissioners. And then following that period, or even during that period, the towns are supposed to, and the county and other governmental agencies are supposed to amend their local ordinances and rules and regulations so that they conform to the land use plan.
And what if they don't? What if one or more towns says, no, we refuse to do this, we think it's a lousy plan?
Well, you mean in terms of the adoption of the plan, or in terms of conforming to the plan? Because
Either.
the first thing that has to happen is the adoption of the plan. The towns have to adopt the findings, and then it goes back to the commissioners, which includes the supervisors. And if they unanimously adopt the plan, then the plan is now in place, and there's no longer any possibility of a sunsetting of the plan. If the towns do not conform their local ordinances and regulations to the plan, which then they would remain under the interim goals and standards that were published 3 months after the first meeting of the commission, until they change their local ordinances to conform to the plan.
What if they don't, what if they never adopt the plan?
Well, then the law would expire in March of 1995.
Are you back to square one?
And
Then you're back to square one, yes.
except that then there would be a violent overthrow of local government by the economic and environmental community. So there's another side to that.
Why don't we take a break, and we'll come back and take more of your questions, and we'll also, we obviously want to continue to talk about the current state of affairs in the Pine Barrens, but we also want to look toward the issue of the role of conveners and facilitators in this, because it poses enormous questions for us in terms of what resources we need in New York State in order, at early stages, to begin to take these conflicts and move them onto the right track. So we want to begin to explore that area with you as well.
Jim earlier said that we could characterize developers as being antithetical to our purposes, but the fact of the matter is we knew all along that each of those developers, while they might be part of some developers group, had a principal focus on their own projects. They were principally concerned about their 14 homes or 20 homes or their opportunity to build a strip mall or some industrial facility. And it was our thought, and it was probably the only area that I think that the society miscalculated. We thought that once the opportunity was presented to avoid a wholesale conflict, that the cool heads of practical business people would prevail, that they would scratch their heads and realize that this was not going to be a useful confrontation, it was a battle that they could not win, and that they would very pragmatically work out a deal. At the same time, we thought the environmentalists would be fairly ideological and dogmatic, and quite frankly, we found the opposite to be true. Our experience throughout this process is with the environmentalists needed to have cool heads and be calculating, and that at meeting after meeting in front of town boards and in early confrontations, developers would rail very, as ideologues, about the private property rights and how America entitled them to do what they wanted to do, and no social misfits were going to interfere with their capacity to. It was just amazing to me that what I learned more than anything else is that there was a lot of anti-intellectual stuff at work. There was a lot of, Jim may have termed it personality. People allowed personalities and their own notions of who they were and what they could do to interfere with judgments that I think retrospectively might have been arrived at earlier. In the meantime, I should also tell you that the Society had carefully plotted out the process through the court system, gauging about how long it would take at each phase, and understanding that we had to play this out all the way to the end, but that we had to be open at every available opportunity to resolve the problem. The characterizations in the press were universally simplistic. The TV reporter in traditional he says, she says sort of journalism would go out and say, here's a person who's concerned about the environment, and here's somebody who's concerned about the economy. Bob Abernathy, CBS News, reporting from Hop Hog, not having resolved or enlightened the public discourse one darn bit, but it was an easy story to do. As the process evolved, we began to show, in fact, it was a deliberate part of the process. The communications design program that the Society adopted required that we spend 75% of our time talking about economic matters and not the environment. The economic issues were clear. It was absolutely certain that we ought to plan first and build later, and so we focused almost universally on the tax implications of overdevelopment, the implications on declining property values, the problems with failing banks. We deliberately talked the economy, figuring that we were clearly going to win in the court of public opinion on the environmental issue, and that we needed simply to debunk the notion that our economy would be booming on Long Island if only we could build more condominiums. So there was a deliberate strategy to do that, and at the same time that it worked in terms of the public opinion, I must say retrospectively that it inflamed the economic community, the developers, more than I thought it would. I must, in fairness, in the very early going, there was actually an offer, the very first, and I'm not sure that very many people in the room know it, the very first offer of a settlement occurred before the case was brought. When the towns realized that the research we were doing and the activities we were taking and the administrative record that we were covering was leading to something, they called us in and had a joint meeting with some of the developers even before the suit was brought, and they simply said, we will do the cumulative impact study that you asked, but there can be no moratorium on development in the interim. That, of course, wasn't acceptable because the whole thing might be built out prior to the time that we developed a plan, and so the matter was left unresolved, and later we were told that the conclusion arrived at by the business leaders at that meeting was really a bluff calling. It was the first of a series of mistakes, calculations, and estimations. Their notion was that we were indeed committed to doing this, but that the resources of this small not-for-profit organization, barely known on Long Island, were simply not sufficient to bring it off, and that rather than to cave in or to in any way stop what was, as Jim pointed out, almost a snowballing rush to development, that they would simply call our bluff and wait to see what happened. The banking industry, for example, very, very involved in the process, were very concerned that this happened, and they were very antagonistic toward the society and other environmental groups when the action was brought. But anecdotally, I must tell you that some 3 or 4 years later, when you encountered these same bankers in informal settings, particularly at cocktail receptions and that sort of thing, they would quietly pat you on the back and say, thank you very much. We were making a lot of bad real estate loans at the time, and we probably would have made a lot more had you not prevented it for us. So it did swing the whole gamut by the time you were done. It was a very, very interesting process, and the only way I can summarize it is that cool heads did not prevail from the outset. That was a surprise to me. I thought that the confrontation would occur and that there would be a withdrawal from that confrontation based on pragmatic understanding, and it took much, much longer to overcome some of the emotions and some of the ideologies and some of the personalities involved.
Let me add
Before you do, let me just add, the test of that proposition about the bank's gratitude to, I suppose, would be measured in how much money they're supporting Long Island Pine Barrens Society with these days. Is that panning out?
No, their excuse is that they lost so much money before we slammed the door that they have none left to give to us.
You get free checking.
Jim,
A toaster now and again, you know.
Somebody asked me out here, what is the Long Island Association? And your question and Dick's answer caused me to give you a little bit of narrative that figures in this drama. Long Island Association is the largest business group on Long Island. It's been around about 75 years or so. And it's the regional chamber of commerce, if you will. But unlike an urban chamber of commerce, we're scattered over 2 counties. We have a larger membership than simply business organizations. And during my time there, we made an effort to involve not-for-profits. There are 300 or so not-for-profit organizations who are members of LIA. Labor is a member of LIA. And clearly, important parts of the business or development, real estate, banking community is part of it. But around the time that this issue was maturing, DEC had begun a process of a moratorium on certain kinds of water permits. I don't remember what year that would have been, but it was 86, 87, somewhere around there. And the developers, the major developers on the island, saw that as a very important threat to them, because the way as I recall the detail, it was actually imposing on the water districts a process that they hadn't had before. And the result was that the major developers on the island decided that the Long Island Association, which I was then heading, was not aggressive enough in its response to this threat that had come through DEC and through this water permit process. And a second group was formed called the Association for a Better Long Island, using 3 of the same words, and created a period of enormous confusion about which business group was which. So as this thing began to develop as a public debate, I think on the environmental side of the debate, there was a readiness to see the economic community much more cohesive and of a single mind than was in fact the reality. The other thing that was happening, because this other group, the ABLI, the Association for Better Long Island, made up of all the major developers, was putting itself on the map, it served their interests to rally their troops by seeing everything as war and confrontation, and a wonderful coming together of interests. But Dick, with a tremendous capacity for public communication, I think described the lawsuit as the most important since the GEIS for the parting of the Red Sea or something. And what did the developers do? But said, yes, this is the most important suit that's ever happened. And Dick didn't even have to characterize how much money was at stake, because the developers did it for them. And what I think they thought they were doing was trying to rally the rest of the economic community by saying, my God, look at what's at stake. So the hyperbole sort of grew, and the people most, in their view, victimized by it were, in a sense, contributing to it, and their new association was finding its voice. And so in the early stage, you really had more of a division within the business community than was apparent to observers, that you had various people speaking for the business community as if it were far more together on this subject and focused than was the case. The reality was, and I think Dick describes it in terms of bankers, but there was, in the upper reaches of the companies that I represented in the LIA, which as many as 4,500 companies at the height of the boom, that saw what was at stake here, not at all in the terms that the developers saw it, but in the larger terms of what kind of a community will we have when this is over. And I think that played an important part in the debate, and when it was possible for the Long Island Association to begin to try to play a role in resolution, we were able to do it because we had this less narrow view, but we had enough standing with the developers, and I think at that point they saw that we had a capacity to mix into the thing.
I can't emphasize just how important that is, and I'll be brief about it. The fact of the matter is that the developers did that. Our attack was, they wanted to make it the economy versus the environment. We see it on so many environmental fronts. And that is, of course, rarely the case, and it was something that we would not permit to happen. And so we kept making distinctions between Long Island's larger economic interests and the interest of developers specifically. And the Long Island Association, with interests in tourism and fishing and farming and so many other, were able to be then positioned. Of course, the developers would have been happy to have them all be embraced under a single umbrella. By the time we were done the second year, one of our marketing studies had showed that developers had moved from among the 3 most respected professions on Long Island to slightly below used car salesmen in terms of the public perception. So it was useful for them to want to take all the great corporations and bring them aboard and say, it's a question of, do you care about money or do you care about trees? And it's just not something, to the LIA's credit, that they really let them do. And it allowed the LIA to emerge in a very key position to bridge a very difficult gap.
Now, did you know that the LIA had a broader view?
No, they kept telling us, but we didn't see it for a long, long time. Because what they would do is that they would sound, because they were always talking about the economy, they always sounded almost indistinguishable from the ABLI, which we, by the way, referred to as the Association to Blacktop Long Island. And they did not, in fact, distinguish themselves accurately in the early going. But the fact of the matter is, they always did the outreach, and they always made themselves available, so that when we finally benefited from their capacity to negotiate, we saw them as leaning the other way, but we saw their utility, we saw the value of their being trusted by the folks who didn't trust us, and aware of the importance to Long Island on a broader plane of what it is that we were trying to do. So it was very, very important.
So it really takes us right to the very central issue of how a process like this gets convened. to those of us who are in the field of dispute resolution, we know that the most difficult part of the process is getting people to the table, to get beyond the rhetoric, to get beyond the polarization, the acrimony, to be able to see that there is hidden potential that nobody is yet defined. So let's see if we can't.
I don't know that to this day, Jim. Who came to you and said, can you talk to these tree huggers? I mean, at some point or other, you knew that there was an opportunity, and you always seemed to know that we were not the zealots or the extremists that we were being portrayed as. At some point or other, you must have recognized that the time was right, or somebody must have come to you and said, you think you can talk some sense to those lunatics?
It didn't happen that way. I described to you how the developers formed their own group, and I will not be able to reconstruct it by timetable, but there came a point where I think the developers discovered that acting on their own and increasingly seen as speaking only for their segment and not the rest of the broad economic community, sought to use us in support of their position. And they're powerful and connected interests, and a lot of them were represented in my board. And I found myself under pressure on this matter and another one involving the Calverton Airport, where there were people within my organization that were trying to basically have us pick up and carry the positions being advocated by these others. And I was very uncomfortable about it, and I resisted it, and I was having trouble. And I finally said to my board that if they wanted to draw the LIA directly into this issue, I would do it, but I would do it on my terms. And my terms were to be to set out to see if a deal could be made, not to set out as yet another advocate for the developer's position. And that was not an easy position to take. I'm not describing myself as heroic or anything, but it was a difficult position to take because of just the politics of a regional business organization, who the interests were and the cross conflicts and everything else. And what I basically had the board agree to was that I would take a period of time to try to see if there was an avenue other than what was being thrust up at us at that point, which was basically to jump into this holy war on behalf of the developers. And there were lots and lots of reasons I didn't want to jump in that way, but I thought it would also be harmful to the LIA, where we had sought to build a broader constituency and play a broader role in the community, than to become almost a subordinate to the developers and their organization. So my board agreed, and I began by simply writing to everybody in the case and asking them if they would come together for lunch. And what was interesting is we got a lot of response that said, sure, what's to lose, a lot of calls and back and forth, but a number of parties who said no. Parties in the environmental community who mistrusted or just did not choose to be involved, and developers and their various orbits, including in some cases their lawyers. And I got some very hostile phone calls from some of the lawyers representing individual developers with individual projects at stake that said that I could wind up meddling and screwing them up, and that I had really better not stumble into this thing as an amateur, because the stakes were very, very high. So when we sort of collected the reaction to that first invitation, we realized that we would not have all of the parties. And then we made a judgment and went out and saw Dick and Bob McGrath and a couple of guys. We sat out on this deck one whole afternoon out there at the Marriott and talked about how much critical mass it would take to even get people talking. And there was a judgment that there were enough positive responses, or at least not negative responses, to get one opportunity going. And that's the premise on which we first got people in for lunch. And we were then able to say to those who were not participating, you might get left behind. We're in there talking about your things, and so a few more came along. But I have to tell you, right up to this day, there are parties and their lawyers who've never come near the process, or me, or any of us, who thought that this was just not appropriate and never participated. But we were right when we made the judgment that while we didn't have everybody, we had enough to begin. And then the story from there becomes an inch at a time and leapfrogging and all the things that happen when a process begins. But it was a combination of my being protective of the institution I represented, the broadness of the membership and the identity we had achieved for LIA that I wanted to protect, a genuine belief that this didn't have to be the way it was shaping up, and probably 6 or 8 other motives clanking around in there as well. But it was enough to go and write that letter, and at that point we had enough standing to at least get a plurality of interest to come.
Tim, is there anything you want to add to the convening story, the role that Jim played, and then the role that you played in it?
In part, I think the Water Authority picked up the ball that he started, and
Can everybody hear?
provided a lot of technical
speak up,
support.
Tim,
Sure. Basically, I've identified 4 basic issues that the Suffolk County Water Authority to describe their role in the process. First is, what is the Suffolk County Water Authority? Why would it get involved in a dispute like this? What role did it play in the negotiation process? And why did our participation in this process work from our perspective? Suffolk County Water Authority is a nonprofit public benefit corporation, and its purpose is to provide and maintain a water system to all the residents of Suffolk County. Of the approximately 1.4 million people in Suffolk County, the Water Authority serves about 1.2 million with safe, dependable drinking water. It is also the largest groundwater supplier in the country, with over 415 wells, 180 pumping stations, and over 4,000 miles of water mains. Why did we get involved in this particular issue? Well, the Central Pine Barrens, as you all know, overlies one of the largest remaining undeveloped tracts of deep water recharge areas in Suffolk County, and those recharge areas are important for us in terms of providing safe, clean drinking water. For several years, the Water Authority had been monitoring development in the area, and we were concerned, along with the rest of the residents of Suffolk County, that the resource was adequately protected. About the same time that the Pine Barrens lawsuit was decided upon by the Court of Appeals, the Water Authority had created a policy and planning department whose role was in part to look at long-term goals and strategies of the Water Authority. This planning department included watershed analysis people, GIS system, which is a geographic information system, which provides computer information about land area, and it also included a pollution prevention program. In addition to that, we had an ongoing land acquisition program, both to protect the resource and also to provide future well fields for providing public water. But also, because we are a corporation, we were interested in seeing controlled or planned growth occur on Long Island. And as the Pine Barren Protection Act was written, it envisions a kind of planned growth in clustered areas, which we thought was very favorable because it would limit the amount of infrastructure that we'd have to construct, but would provide theoretically just as many customers in a smaller area, so that it would reduce our overall capital and operating costs. Well, that gets back down to the question of what role the authority actually did play. And the primary role we played was facilitator and at sometimes mediator. We provided staff and technical support for groups of meetings that occurred over several months, staff, 2 or 3 staff persons were dedicated to attending the meetings, trying to take down all the notes of things that occurred at the meetings, which at the end of meetings sometimes it was hard to tell what did happen and what was agreed to. But when there were questions, we would just use our discretion in terms of what we thought the interests of all the parties were, and try to put that on paper, which is a very difficult step from getting a concept, which was largely worked out at the LIA, to putting that concept to paper is a very difficult process. It requires a lot of staff, a lot of time, and you have to have the resources in terms of office equipment, microcomputers, copy machines, faxes, phones. It really is a tremendous process to try to take down all the information and then disseminate it to a large audience in a timely fashion, because we were really working under the gun in terms of the legislative process and getting something done this year so that there would be some type of resolution to the dispute. A second factor in terms of our participation, in terms of playing the role as a mediator, was in the form of Michael LoGrande, who's the Water Authority's Chief Executive Officer and also the Chairman of the Board. He had formerly been County Executive for the County of Suffolk, and he was a supervisor in the town of Islip, which isn't in the Central Pine Barrens, but gave him great respect for the perspective of towns in this process. He's well respected in the county and probably statewide with respect to his commitment to resolving public problems and his support of doing good things from the governmental perspective for the people. He went to great lengths to actually get the right parties to the table, actually set up the meetings, provide a neutral meeting spot for them in Water Authority facilities, provided lunches in many occasions, and during the actual negotiation sessions or the process of putting the ideas to paper, as you can imagine, there were often conflicts that arose, and he served from his position as a person who would refocus the dispute or the issues and say, well, we know we have a problem with that, but how can we get around it? He offered his experience in government in terms of how to solve a lot of the problems that we were facing at the time, and his trust from both sides of the table, the trust in him as a public servant, provided sufficient grease for the process of getting a concept to actually putting it on paper. Because as you know, once you try to put an idea on paper, many times it can change, and the changing of a few words could change the meaning significantly. So that was the technical support position and mediation position that the Water Authority played. Why did the Water Authority participation work? I think primarily because we provided a neutral meeting ground for people. We had an interest in both aspects of the argument. And so people recognized that we had an interest in resolving the conflict too, and they trusted our organizational position to settle a compromise in a way that would be good for all parties. The second, that we had the availability of staff and resources that we could commit for a long period of time, both in the negotiation process, but in addition, as you all may know, the Water Authority has gone on to provide substantial financial support for the planning process. One of our staff members is currently the executive director for the commission. I have dedicated a lot of my time to working on a lot of the issues that are involved with the plan. We have provided geographic information system support, which is critical for a planning process when you're trying to get a job done in a very short period of time. it covers a large tract of land. You need some highly technical office equipment to support that time frame. In summary, I think that the reason our participation worked is because we had a real purpose of protecting the resource and also allow certain planned growth. We provided a sort of neutral setting that everyone recognized would be neutral from their own interests, and finally we had sufficient source of funds and resources to dedicate to the actual transition from an idea to a piece of paper that could pass as legislation, and that was primarily our support, and it continues on in the development of the plan.
Just inviting people to lunch and building an initial meeting around the breaking of bread, which has great social and relationship significance. But that can be a useful device, for example, and maybe there are other things you can think of that made a difference in moving the relationship.
Anecdotally, we arrived at this meeting this day at the Long Island Association, and
Is that where the meeting was? Was that the association?
And actually met for the first time people that we had been warring with in public. And I can recall anecdotally that this was a period on Long Island where it had where this meeting followed 7 consecutive days of rain. Everybody, they called them rainy days, and everybody was making duck jokes and that sort of thing. And we always call them aquifer recharge days, being the environmentalists that we are. And I can remember being one of the early people to arrive at the meeting, and seated in the room were 2 developers of 2 of the biggest projects on Long Island. And one of them was has proposed to build the largest shopping center on Long Island. And I can remember very deliberately taking my coat off and trying to break the natural tension. I said, well, surely the aquifer has been sufficiently recharged. We ought to be able to figure out how to build a mall or 2, huh? And nobody laughed. I mean, there was no... it was the stuff. Okay, let me go out. We'll start again. It's not going to be as easy as this. But there was an implicit distrust from having played this out in the public arena for so long that no one was prepared to be human with anybody for a good long period of time.
So what changed that?
Well, just that same day, I did not know until that day that Dick Amper and Willie Breslin, who was a major developer and a key player in all this, I did not know until that day that Dick Amper and Willie Breslin had never met. I just assumed, and if I had thought about it, I guess there's no reason to assume it, but that they had never actually met and talked to one another.
Country club.
But just to follow on that, Tim, here for a second, we should underscore the role that Mike LoGrande played, because while all of these parties were talking about water, Mike owned it in the sense that the Suffolk Water Authority actually had the control over this water system, and brought not just credibility to the process, but a tremendous proprietorship to the subject, and had a concern that was sort of lurking around the process. And going back to the earlier matter I mentioned when the DEC had the moratorium, that there were public representations being made in many quarters about the quality of Long Island's water. And nothing is more dangerous to the economy than to have a bad image out there of the water quality. And we've had some genuine problems, and we've had some problems simply of image development and so forth. So when the Water Authority began to play its role with its enormous technical capacity, that was a very critical and credible ingredient to this process. And Mike is by nature sort of self-effacing, and I don't think has blown his own horn enough on this thing, but he played, and his gang played an enormous, and continue to play an enormously important role.
Jim, on that front, a part of Michael LoGrande's background that was not discussed are two parts that are important. One of them, while he was acting Suffolk County executive, he proposed this clean drinking water protection program, the quarter-penny sales tax program, that would have simultaneously compensated private property owners and preserved drinking water recharge areas. At the same time, after he left the county executive's job, he also served as the head of the ABLI, the developers group. And I raise this again only because in dealing both with the LIA and in dealing with the Water Authority, we knew we were dealing with people who were trusted by the developers and that they were going to be able to facilitate conversations and understandings that might otherwise be possible, even though we were fearful that they might be disposed to take a preferential side. We saw them as essential to bridging the gap in dialogue, and that was very, very helpful to the process. I'd echo also Jim's very key observation that the Water Authority was equipped to deliver on the program, to translate ideas to paper and agreements on territory to maps. There were technical things that allowed this thing to move along that merely talking to one another did not do, and the Water Authority's making its resources available will turn out historically to have been decisive in this process.
Before we leave this subject, there's got to be one good 30-second Bob Wiebold anecdote. I know they're out there, so someone's got to come up with one. Anybody?
You'd say he didn't show up.
I mean, I know, because I've heard from other stories, there were times when he did something that was...
Well,
and I just
the
wanna make
thing
sure
that was
he's
most amazing to us when we
acknowledged
finally
in-
got down and sat down to him and his Long Island associate, Buzz Schwenk, of the Long Island Builders Institute, is that you got a chance while you're standing around in Albany waiting for this barbaric process to work, to simply go back and reflect and compare notes as to what you were doing while we were doing this, or what you were thinking while we were thinking that. And it really did provide an opportunity for you to see on a more human, on a more strategic basis, what everybody was thinking and how people were evolving their senses of who their opponents were. And I do remember Schwenk sitting with Wiebold and saying, you know, this may work out. It's not like the Pine Barrens Maritime Reserve Council. That was an earlier effort to placate environmentalists without actually building a plan or committing dollars into it by saying, we're going to designate this as a bioreserve, but we're really not going to fund the group that will do anything. You've had enough of those episodes. And Schwenk, who invariably saw himself as a builder and who invariably saw this as a contrast to the environmental community, said, that was an absurd commission. It was comprised of 16 environmentalists and Ray Cowan, who was the head of the Department of Environmental Conservation, regional office of the Department of Environmental Conservation on Long Island. He was suggesting that his only ally in this earlier group was the head of the Department of Environmental Conservation. So there was just this whole evolution of how people were regarding one another and how they were making distinctions between what their ostensible role was in the process and what it was going to have to be if we were going to start doing something different. It was just very unusual. We would show up talking. Schwenk and I were encountered at one of those 2 o'clock in the morning nights in the end of the session by Ralph Marino, who stopped dead in his tracks. He had not met with either of us. We dealt exclusively with staff through the entire process, and he said, "Whoa, the odd couple. We're going to have a hard time dealing with this." And it really was revealing, because for the first time we saw that while government, especially local government, had played economic interests off against environmental interests, that it was going to be very, very difficult to do that if these two unlikely characters maintained solidarity.
That's great. I'm going to take a quick question over here. I hope it's a quick one.
Right.
Go ahead.
Okay. Earlier, Tim Hopkins mentioned that the plan would have to be adopted prior to starting the DGEIS. And I was wondering, what are some of the issues that will be coming up for adoption and prior to going into starting the draft generic environmental rules?
Actually, I don't know what I don't remember what I said before.
Louder,
but
Tim,
the DGIS is part of the plan, actually, so it's going on simultaneous while the plan is adopted. It's a simultaneous process. So we recently had the scoping session, and the positive declaration was also recently published in the EMB. But the issues that we're trying to do is, the basic concept is we want to front load as much environmental analysis as possible in terms of where development can occur and what level can be sustained in certain areas. If it's going to be more intense in certain areas and no development or little development in other areas, to front load the analysis so that basically the work is done so that a developer knows with certainty that it can go to an area and develop that area without facing 4 or 5 or 6 years of environmental review process, which is a big drain. Part of the entire process is creating certainty in terms of land development and things like that on Long Island, and everyone feels that that will be a net benefit. But
Does the plan basically highlight the environmental critical properties?
yes,
here?
part of the prescription of the act is to designate critical resource areas, and after the plan is implemented, if it is adopted, would be one of the theoretically the commission would fall into the background and local government would take over. They would be restricted from doing things that were not in conformity with the plan, but the commission would retain jurisdiction and responsibility for areas designated as critical resource areas. So that would be their ongoing role, to have jurisdiction over those identified areas in the plan.
So is there a set deadline as to when the plan would be adopted? What if
yes.
they don't agree? Okay, what is that?
That's March of 1995.
Jim, you had one more
Just,
little
you're
story for
looking
us?
for famous moments in the course of this. After the Court of Appeals, there was a couple of months, I guess, when everybody was sort of regrouping and the like. And Dick and I had lunch one day, and he had put together an elaborate kit of how he was going to approach the legislature that year and so forth. I asked him then if I understood the process was you wanted to have an environmental impact process, not in its for its own sake, but in order to produce a plan. And in my feeble mind, a plan, when you were talking about land, was a map. And could we not sort of jump through these steps, assuming certain things, and actually produce a map of what you thought this place called the Central Pine Barrens should actually look like when all of these processes you were pursuing would be achieved? And Dick produced such a map, penciled in. It was a very crude, but it allocated 2 colors of pink and 2 colors of green, from most developed to least developed, or most preserved. And I set about with this map, calling on the different parties, and in every case I said I want to indulge a fiction, and the fiction is that I produced this map, because I had to that point never actually sat and looked at a map of what this dispute was all about. But in terms of key moments, the most remarkable thing began to happen. When I would lay the map out in front of developers, more often than not the reaction would be, I think I can live with this. And I think, in looking back on it, maybe if we had reduced it to something as crude as an actual picture earlier on, the perceived threats would not have been seen as quite so threatening. But when you saw it all arrayed in this fashion, accounting for all of the property that was already in some degree of protection, and then added these other concepts, somehow the visualization of it, in my mind, caused a lot of people to move another step or two. And then, of course, after a number of those rounds, we'd bring them back together, and then with Dick, and have the two of them sit and fuss over the map. And I think in cardinal points, that was a key one.
Overall, it was the first and the clearest representation of something that was to work time and time again. Where we got bogged down in problems was where one side or the other wanted to come up with some sweeping, general solution to a problem. And where we could not solve that, we kept turning the conversation or the dialogue back in and saying, who will this impact in real life? Is this an operative problem? What if we did it this way? How many developments will really be affected? How many acres of key preservation area will really be lost? Instead of focusing on the general thesis that has to work for everybody for all time, let's deal with the real life specifics of life within this 100,000 acres.